I'd like to welcome everybody here today, guests and our distinguished panelists. Welcome to the British Council. Tonight we'll be exploring the benefits and challenges of multilingual education in India. We have a very distinguished panel, and I know it'll be a very entertaining and lively discussion. We had some discussions earlier today which were absolutely fantastic. But first I'd like to invite Jill Caldicott, who's the Director of Operations for the British Council in India, to welcome you to the event.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you here at the British Council. You all know that language is absolutely essential part of our work, so fantastic that you're all here and we'll have such an interesting panel discussion this evening. I understand that you represent over a dozen key institutions from across India, and all of you are working on various aspects of education and language. That's fantastic, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome some of our guests from overseas, Professor Janine Treffers-Dalla, I hope I've got the pronunciation right, and Professor Ianthi Tsimpli. From both of them, I believe, from the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism at Reading University, and they're here with us today. Fantastic. I was telling them that I myself did an MA in Applied Linguistics from Reading, have very fond memories of it, but it was such a long time ago, they don't know any of the people I knew. But a very, very good experience. So, the importance of multilingualism in life as well as education. And as someone who's worked a lot in the European Union, I have been very close to that notion that multilingualism is so important for national cultures and for the people who live there. Last year, British Council published our English Impact Report jointly with Pratham ASER Centre. And in that report, we touched upon some of the issues around multilingualism. One of the essays in that volume by Janine, and also by Jason Rothman from the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism at Reading, highlighted the cognitive and clinical benefits of speaking many languages. Analysis of ASER data from 2007 to 2012 showed conclusively that there was strong positive correlation between mother tongue acquisition, or L1, and English learning outcomes, L2. We are delighted to have with us tonight as well Unicef and JNU University National Multilingual Resource Centre, NMLRC, which through the untiring efforts of Professor Ajit Mohanty and Minati Panda have succeeded in Odisha becoming the first state in India to formally adopt an MLE policy in school education. Congratulations. One of the primary conclusions that David Graddle drew in English Next India, a report commissioned by us, and I expect many of you are familiar with it, was that the blind predilection for English medium instruction has been or was responsible for significant damage to education outcomes in India. And as someone who's worked in other countries as well, like Hong Kong, I know there were some similar conclusions. British Council belief about language education. We firmly believe in the primacy of the mother tongue, its importance in the early years of education, and the equality of all languages. British Council is one of the signatories to the Juba Declaration on Languages in Education, adopted for Africa last year, and we stand by each of those 9 principles. In many states in India, and Odisha is a prime example, where the home language of learners is different from the state language. And then there's Hindi, the national language, and finally, possibly, also English for those who need it. These are difficult transitions for students as well as teachers. There is possibly a space for English in India's immense diversity and complex educational needs. I know Professor Ramkant Agnihotri has argued passionately for that for a long time. The space for English needs to be thought through carefully and based on evidence, and certainly should not come at the expense of the rich bhashas of India. And we need to figure out a way of how home language can support the learning of other languages. Let me speak for just a moment on policy contexts, international and national. This research roundtable is an important step towards a partnership approach to work out a range of possible solutions towards the challenges posed, but also to demonstrate British Council's commitment towards multilingual education, and indeed towards the UN's Education for All goals, of which skills and livelihoods is a key part. The context for this work in multilingual education could not have come at a more apt time. Recently, the government, as I'm sure you all know, has announced its commitment to language education in school by apportioning at least 300 hours per student per year for language acquisition. I have very great pleasure in announcing that we, British Council, have successfully bid for the Language and Development Conference for 2015. This is a prestigious biennial conference which attracts policymakers and practitioners in language education and development from all over the world, and it will be held here in Delhi in November in 2015. The theme of the conference is being discussed with the trustees, but there's a very strong likelihood that it will be around the role of multilingualism in dealing with some of the bigger challenges of the 21st century, with such rapid urbanization, livelihood issues, domestic migration, and integrated inclusive communities that we all desire. Back to these 2 days. What we hope to achieve in these 2 days of this research roundtable is build the nucleus of a robust research project that will gather evidence for practical, implementable solutions. We can only do this in partnership, and that means all of you. And I very much hope that the early findings of the collaborative research can then be presented at the Language and Development Conference in just over a year's time. Thank you very much for coming and for your time. And I wish this research initiative every success. And I look forward to seeing you again later this evening. Now I'd like to hand back to Michael, and who will be introducing the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Could we have our panelists on the stage? Dhir, Ianthi, Paul, Rukmini, and of course Debanjan. Thank you. By sheer coincidence, they've all sat in the order that I have them on my paper, which helps me a lot. So I don't know how that's happened. But I'd first like to introduce on the far left, Dr Jhingran. Dr Jhingran is presently Senior Advisor Education with Unicef India. He has worked in the primary education sector for over 2 decades within and outside the government. He served as Principal Secretary in the Government of Assam and Director in the Ministry of Human Resource Development. He has been part of the development and implementation of several Education for All programs in the country, including the District Primary Education Programme, Janshala, and the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Dhir holds a master's degree in economics and a PhD in education. Next is Ianthi Tsimpli, is a professor of multilingualism and cognition at the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences at the University of Reading, and professor of psycholinguistics and director of the Language Development Lab at the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. That was quite a mouthful. She teaches and researches in first and second language acquisition, bilingualism, language impairment, psycholinguistics, and theoretical syntax. Oh, not quite. The next one's Rukmini. I nearly said Paul. Rukmini Banerji has been with Pratham since 1996. Along with her colleagues, she has worked to build large-scale programs for helping children go to school and learn well. This is done via partnerships with state governments and with village communities. Today, Pratham is active in more than 150 districts around India and also in over 30 cities. Rukmini is the director of ASER Centre, the research and assessment unit of Pratham, and she heads the ASER Initiative Annual Status of Education Report. ASER is the largest annual study ever done by Indian citizens to monitor the status of elementary schooling and basic learning in the country. Paul Gunashekar is Head Department of Materials Development, Testing and Evaluation at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad, where he has worked since 1975. Paul specializes in ELT course design, ESP, and teacher development, and has considerable experience in developing teaching materials for national and state agencies. And last but not least, perhaps, is Dr Debanjan Chakrabarti of the British Council. Debanjan is Head English Language Policy Research and Publications for the British Council in India. Debanjan has worked for the British Council for 14 years, and at the British Council he has been part of the English Partnerships team from the start of our programs in 2007. Debanjan has taught English and films at Visha Bharati University, Shantiniketan, that's quite difficult, and at the University of Reading, from where he obtained his PhD. So he had started his career as a journalist for The Telegraph, writing on education, language, literature, and films. So I'll hand over to Debanjan. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Right at the start, I should explain the structure of today's panel discussion. It's quite simple, really. I have discussed with the panelists a couple of opening questions, which they will address in 5 minutes each, approximately. They will come to the podium and respond to those initial questions. And from there on, we will have a really open discussion, fielding questions from the audience and even among the panelists, and we will do that sitting down over there. Finally, I'll come back to the panelists in the third section and request them to wrap up whatever they had to say on the issue of benefits and challenges of multilingual education in India and elsewhere. And that's relatively straightforward. But I thought I'll quickly start with a warm-up exercise. Can I have a quick show of hands for people in the audience who have or speak only one language? Who speak or have only one language?
One language at a time.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, we hadn't figured it. Any one of those, sort of, to any degree. I mean, anyone here who thinks of himself or herself as a monolingual? Anyone who thinks herself or himself to have two languages? Oh, wow. 2 or 3 languages? And more than that? Wonderful. We couldn't have hoped for a better audience, really. I mean, benefits and challenges of multilingual education in India and possibly elsewhere. Just a few opening comments about just setting the context. Multilingualism, as we have heard, has been a fact of life for India for a very long time. The idea of modern India is also rooted to ideas of multilinguality, plurilinguality. We see many formal expressions of that in our postage stamp, for example, in our currency notes, and in advertising slogans like "Ye dil mange more." Professor Mohanty, in our earlier deliberations on the research that we are trying to develop, pointed out about the historical multilingualism and also the seamless multiglossic society that we have, which has sometimes been problematized by administrative measures and policies such as linguistic organization of states. We heard from Professor Ianthi Tsimpli about the advantages of multilingualism for cognitive abilities of children, but also with distinct clinical benefits such as dealing with dyslexia, delaying dementia, and Alzheimer's, among others. At the level of education and policy, India has tried to espouse a three-language formula from secondary education onwards. But in practice, I think there have been issues with language education and language of classroom instruction at all levels of formal education. And the three-language formula is quite interesting for me because it was, I think, formally espoused during, by the Kothari Commission in the 1960s when Triguna Sen was the Education Minister of India. And I've heard and read lots of deliberations around that. But one of the most working solutions that I have come across was propounded by the Kannada author U.R. Ananthamurthy, who recently passed away. He had this wonderful idea, theory of a home language, a playground language, and a language of the marketplace. And the way he propounded it, they were not fixed entities, but they were on a flexible scale where one alternated or sometimes were used simultaneously. Maybe not at the same time, but certainly in close conjunction. A point that I'd like to make very clear is that the purpose of this evening's discussion is not at all about English or merits or demerits of English medium instruction. However, I do think it's futile for us to wish away the pink elephant or the black swan, whatever you call it in the room. And also for this discussion to resonate with the current urban and rural reality of India is we have to consider the position of English within Indian education. The key facts I think we should consider while thinking of about English in education is that we have an incredibly young population. Probably a quarter of India's population is between the age of 14 and 25, and they all seek good education and access to livelihoods. We discussed today that English is very much present in India. How it's taught is a different question. And it's also been argued that English could be seen as an Indian language at par with the Indian bhashas. NCERT's research data shows that currently 25 out of our 30 states start English at class 1, and other states introduce at some level of primary education. And there are a number of dangers around English. I think with that kind of introductory note, I'd like to invite the panelists to give their responses to the initial question. Ianthi, if I may start with you. The question I have for you is, what do current research studies and policies say about the language of instruction in school systems globally?
I can be here. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Well, to start with, I think that actually when I saw the title of the discussion about multilingual education, I started thinking about whether you mean education of multilingual children or education of any child that is multilingual. So it's, there are two issues here. And in India, I think you have both. Okay, so you've got multilingual children who go into a multilingual educational environment, and you may have monolingual or bilingual children who go into a multilingual education environment. So, I mean, in terms of research, I can speak mostly as a psycholinguist rather than as a policy maker. What I can say is that at least from what we know from current research and recent research in the field, children who are either forced for reasons of immigration or whatever the choice of parents to develop literacy in a language which is not their native language, they usually don't seem to have the advantages that you mentioned in your introduction of bilingualism, as much as children who actually start off, at least, with mother tongue literacy. So, and I think that in psycholinguistics, one of the reasons why we know this is the natural thing to do is because we are made in the human nature. We have to speak and understand the language. We learn how to speak and understand the language in our preschool years, and then when we go to school, we learn how to read and write in that language that we have already built oral knowledge of, right? So it's just the natural way, the natural course of things. Now, when is the right time to introduce other languages to make a multilingual educational system? There have been some practices around the world. I have to say that UK is not, I think, the best country to actually look for multilingual education. There are many children in the UK who have English as an additional language, but these children rarely have state-provided support for mother tongue literacy, right? So, and in these cases, what we know from research is that these children in the first 3 or 4 years of schooling, they seem to lag behind their age peers who are monolingual in terms of reading and writing development. Some of them later catch up, some of them don't. Okay, and in recent projects that are actually still ongoing, what we have seen is that if you take the same group of bilinguals who are monoliterate and you make them biliterate, then suddenly you get all these cognitive advantages that you talked about before. So it seems to be the case that what the languages we know how to speak and understand are best supported in our academic development if they are also supported in literacy terms. Okay, so.
Dhir, my next question is to you, if I may. Would you like to go there? Yeah. What do you think are the issues and challenges for a multilingual approach to education in India, especially at the primary level? And how can India's immense diversity of languages be used as resources in the classroom rather than an hindrance? And you have immense experience in this field.
Thanks, Debanjan. I'd like to highlight just one aspect. I mean, there are many things that need to be done just to make it simple. And my one point that I'd like to emphasize is that language teaching practices of whatever language need to be completely overhauled in our country. And I've done a lot of research in the last few years. And basically, I mean, I wanted to show some videos here today, but just to, I mean, you must have seen so many classrooms, but basically it's the teacher who's doing a lot of practice, speaking a lot. Children rarely speak in our language classrooms. In that research that I did, and about 5 minutes in about 150 language classrooms, and I found 92% of the words were spoken by the teacher in the language classrooms. The high level of dependence on the textbook, and the textbook, as we discussed in the morning, could be very difficult in terms of the language difficulty level. Of course, divorced from the local context and children's experiences. And a lot of reading that happens is choral repetition because that's the practice, but also because the teacher knows that children actually cannot read. So there's a farce that is played out of the teacher or another student reading and the others repeating, and that's seen to be a reading lesson. There's very little meaning-based work, a lot of drills around, as I said, choral repetition, but also handwriting practice and copying. So in this research, I found that about 50% of the time that a child spends on task, doing anything in the classroom, is on chanting and copying. And as you all know, grade 1 basically starts with teaching of literacy, ka, kha, ga, and there's very little time for oral work, discussion, conversation, etc., which really for a child who doesn't have that language, the school language background, makes it even more difficult. So as many other researchers have done, I've also actually agreed with them that what plays out in Indian language classrooms is a safe process. Safe in the sense that the teacher is safe. She is teaching and speaking all the time, very busy. The children are also very busy. They're either chanting or copying. And if you go to the classroom, there seems to be a lot of activity happening, but very little learning. So it's a very safe process where no one's really at fault, but nothing much happens. So in the end, I'd just like to, so I'm not talking about big solutions or mother tongue-based multilingual education programs. My simple point is that if we can change the way language is taught in our classrooms and these are some of the dimensions that I mentioned. And I would say if we were to follow a very minimum approach of what is sort of non-negotiable or essential, and I borrow a little, borrow from Krashen, a linguist, and some other things. One, that anything that happens in the classroom should be comprehensible to children. Seems very logical, but often not the case. Language is learned best in an anxiety-free environment. So if a child is trying to learn a new language, you shouldn't start assessments immediately on that language. Meaningful use of language is very crucial, not just depend on the textbook, because the textbook is very often not comprehensible, and not just repetitive drills. Scaffolding of using the child's language is absolutely crucial. So, okay, let's work with the second language, but a lot of scaffolding with the child's language, focus on oral language work, and bilingual teachers. I mean, this is like a minimum agenda for a language classroom where we have children from other languages. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhir. Thank you, Dhir, and also for pointing out one of the trends that many of us working in education have noticed, that it's language education that is in a point of crisis in India, and it's not to do with any particular language. Moving on, Rukmini, I have a question for you, which is around what kind of innovations, best practices, or even emerging practices, a term that we discovered today, in multilingual education seem to be working in India for students as well as teachers?
So this is a trick question, because unlike everybody else who's on the stage, I'm not a language person, L1, L2, L5, any of the Ls. And I think that the best that I can do is to say that been an observer of sort of many languages and the experiences children have around many languages, and the frustrations around the fact that we don't perhaps use the backgrounds that children bring to the classroom more effectively. If Professor Panda had been here, she was supposed to be on this panel, then she could have, I'm sure, given a far better introduction to innovative practices that both she and her team, Professor Mohanty, Dr. Mishra, many other people who have done in India. But I'd like to say a couple of sort of more general things. One is that it is surprising to me, given, again, I speak as an observer and somebody who works with children, it's surprising to me how little work is done on large scale in India on language. The work that has been done, I think, is focused in a couple of states where very intensive, I think very thoughtful work, which is both practical and theory have developed. But vastly across India, given that I think that almost any child coming to school is coming with a language that isn't a familiar language. And by this I don't mean linguistically, but I just mean the language that children come from home and the language that they have to deal with in school, I think we must accept are different, whether they are actually a different, wholly different language or not. And despite many years of all kinds of programs, I think we are, I don't know how one measures this, but there should be a measure of how unprepared schools are for accepting children in their first year of school. There's a lot of work done on whether children are ready to go to school. But I think that we must be, if there was an index of how unready schools are for accepting the first round of education, and it also seems very surprising to me how little we are innovating on this front. I mean, why are more people not frustrated? I think a lot of innovation comes out of frustration, out of dissatisfaction, out of discontent. And like he described, we're very happy to slide into a safe environment where you just follow whatever has been done or whatever is the prevailing. So I wonder what it will take. I know I'm not answering your question, but I wonder what it will take to challenge many more people. And these people don't necessarily don't have to only be in schools. I mean, I don't know, I've only heard about the Odisha project from afar, but I think one of the strengths is it had many different kinds of people who were focused on trying to grapple with what would be the most, what would be a most meaningful way forward. It was not only left to the people within the education department or schools or experts. So what will it take for exactly, creating a platform on which a wide cross-section of people would really worry about how can we bring, both on the outside the school as well as inside the school. The new government has not announced any dramatic new positions, other than the fact that we should have toilets, which is, undeniable. Of course, we should have toilets, but it may not help language instruction directly, at least from the research that exists now. But they have, I think, backed the beginnings of a standard 1 and 2 focus that started already earlier before they came. And I wonder if this is the right time to really push on the fact that you need to get your standard 1 and 2 ready for accepting a very diverse section of children. Of course, there are good practices, as there always are, but there are far more bad practices. Perhaps we should also get away from just thinking about best practices to thinking about what are superbly bad practices that we should never do. Kind of a non-negotiable, as Dhir is saying. So at least people know that what I'm doing is not the right thing to do. And then perhaps we will, on a large scale, worry about, how do we come up and evolve. I think none of these things are instant. Education is not Maggi noodles. It can't happen over, 3 minutes. But I think that what is disappointing is that we are not on a path of incrementally coming up with what are the better things to do. There's a lot of language debate in the local media, but very little discussion locally on, what, and certainly for a whole variety of reasons, our hand-wringing about language seems to be at a much higher level than at first standard or when children are coming in or when their foundations are being built. So I haven't answered your question, but I'd like to keep some of these things on the table because I think these are things that we really need to worry about. It's in the MLE, I think it is both the L and the E, and we've had a discussion in the morning about what that M should stand for. But I think it's both the education and the language. If they don't go together in some aligned way, we are not going to get the learning that we want.
Thank you for that position, and also for highlighting possibly the fact that even if the home language and the school language coincide at some level, they could be different at other level. Very often I'm reminded of what I call airline English, airline Hindi, and Kripya kursi ki peti bandh le is something that many Hindi speakers would probably be slightly, would take them a moment to realize what's being instructed on the airline. Turning to you, Paul, what do you think is the position of English among other languages in Indian education, and what do you think is driving this massive demand for English medium instruction?
I think this is meant for the men here. Ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be a rather bookish, formal kind of presentation, unlike my three friends here. Two, I can't help being an English teacher when I make this short little presentation. Let me put this in perspective now. There have been two significant developments in the last year and a half, both related to the Union Public Service Commission. In March last year, UPSC took three important decisions. One, providing added weight to English in the prestigious civil services examinations starting later in the year. That is, marks obtained in English would have a distinct bearing on the merit list and the gradation. Two, setting down the condition that there should be at least 25 candidates formally declaring their intention to take the exams in a regional language. And 3, those candidates who choose to write the exams in a regional language should have graduated in that language. Now, when the proposed changes were tabled in Parliament, there was an uproar. Cutting across party lines, the members of the Lok Sabha roundly criticized the changes, with the result that the union government decided to put the proposed measures on hold. It is assumed that the UPSC proposed the changes in support of their belief in the now familiar dictum, English for development. Parliament, however, saw the changes as an elitist conspiracy to disadvantage rural students, rural candidates, whose English, members claimed, was not good enough to compete against the privileged English-speaking urban candidates. In a related development in July this year, a large number of largely Hindi-speaking candidates led an agitation in Delhi against the Civil Services, UPSC, Civil Services Aptitude Test, familiarly referred to as CSAT, alleging that the test favors candidates who studied in English medium schools. They demanded a Hindi alternative to the compulsory use of English in the current test format. Again, put under severe pressure by the agitation and the opposition in Parliament, the government unceremoniously decided that marks scored in English in CSAT would not affect merit or gradation. This imbroglio has shifted attention from more substantial issues in language use and language education to linguistic chauvinism and political brinkmanship. If English is the acknowledged gateway to modern scientific knowledge, accelerated economic growth, and upward social mobility, there is a strong argument in favor of English and English education being the instrument of change and development for children from the marginalized and underprivileged segments of the Indian society. It also accounts for the socio-political pressure that has led to English being introduced as a subject of study from the earliest years in primary school in most Indian states. Critics of this move, my own colleagues at the university, however, have been quick to point out that deliberate prominence being accorded to English in school education would only alienate Indian children from their cultural roots and reduce their esteem for their own languages, which in turn would lead to cultural atrophy. While this debate continues to rage, we need to remind ourselves of a home truth. And let me quickly refer to Kacharu's very familiar terms. The instrumental, the regulative, the interpersonal, and the imaginative functions that English performs are all located in multiple layers of diversity. To avoid falling into the monolingual trap, the instrumental function, that is, the use of English as a medium of learning at various stages in the educational system in particular, should be seen to be performed in multilingual and multicultural settings. When the settings are acknowledged and accepted, learners, teachers, and teacher educators can be persuaded to regard English not merely as a utilitarian acquisition, but as a major contributor to personal development and as an invaluable tool for understanding India's pluralistic society. In a lecture last year at EFLU, Kumara Vadivelu made this very interesting comment, and I quote, "One's cultural growth should be rooted in one's own cultural traditions, but must also be enriched by an ability and willingness to learn not only about other cultures, but also from other cultures. Learning about other cultures merely leads us to cultural literacy. It is learning from other cultures that will lead us to cultural liberty." Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And you have sort of nailed it on the head for on the topic. And I think that will immediately sort of stir a number of questions from the audience, and it is time to take a few questions from the audience. The way I would like to deal with this is take maybe 3 questions at a time. And while putting the questions, I have a couple of requests. Please make sure it's a question and not a mini thesis. It's an earnest request. And if it's a comment, again, keep it very brief. Say who you are, and please use the microphone because we are trying to record this session.
I'm R.K. Dhawan from University of Delhi. I teach English. I was thinking, when we talk about multilingual education, I immediately think of multicultural education, because knowledge of a particular language leads to the knowledge of that culture also. So would you say that approach to multilingual education would be almost the same as that of approach to multicultural education? Anybody can answer this?
Yes, this is an excellent question, because I think that there is no way that you can be multilingual without being multicultural, and in a sense, it makes it easier. I mean, language makes it easier for us to get into the cultural issues, not only at the level of thinking about why a particular language expresses certain issues, certain concepts, certain notions differently from another that we also know, but also because it's a question of, for example, how each language categorizes similar concepts, right? So it seems to be the case that language carries culture on its sleeve. And I think that when you have multilingual education, it is an important part to actually be able to read original texts at some level. I mean, when you reach the proficiency, the level of proficiency that you need, to be able to get a better grasp of the differences in the culture. In India, I think, I mean, I'm an outsider in this case, but in India, I think that there is no real danger except for English, I think, education here. There's no real danger of becoming multicultural, because you do have the multicultural aspect anyway. So if it is a question about teaching English and how you can teach the English culture, I'm not the right person to answer that.
There's another question, the lady in blue.
I'm Snelata, and I am researching second language reading at the University of Delhi, Department of Education. The question is to you. You said that in the UK, the children who come to schools with a different home language do not really receive state support to develop literacy in that home language. They don't receive state support, but some catch up in the later years and some don't. I mean, has your research, could you share some of the research or anything that you've read that says, that answers why that happens? I mean, the ones who catch up, what is it in their learning or teaching that helps them to catch up? And the ones who don't, why don't they? Briefly, some ideas.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question with regard to reading. You see, the research, I mean, not about UK only, but generally, it seems to be the case that it very much depends if you're looking at the decoding abilities that are related to the writing systems. It really has to do with how distant or proximal the two systems are. So if you are bilingual between Chinese and English, there doesn't seem to be an advantage if you know how to read Chinese on, your development of reading in English, but there is no disadvantage either, right? But if you come from a language that has, as we say, a shallow orthography, that is what you read is what you pronounce, right? So there is a direct grapheme to phoneme correspondence. It seems that this type of transparent languages actually help development of reading in deep language, deep orthography languages like English, which are notoriously difficult even for monolingual English children, right? So it seems to be that at that level of decoding, there is an advantage if you have that combination of languages. So if you have Spanish, for example, this is a combination I know of, Spanish or Italian, and you move to, for example, English, then you have you are able to go through the stages much earlier. The disadvantage that I mentioned was when you have children that come from a home language, regardless of what the writing system is of that home language, and they are entered into a monolingual English educational system where there is no support for literacy in the language that they have already mastered in terms of phonology, grammar, semantics, pragmatics, all the levels of linguistic analysis, right? And it is for these children that there seems to be some delay in their development of reading and writing in English, right?
Other questions? I was just also hoping to bring Professor Mohanty and Dr. Mishra into the conversation around, because we heard the Odisha model being talked about so much. I was wondering if Professor Mohanty, you would like to say a few words about the point that Rukmini was making, that not all languages are being used properly in the classroom, and there are some appalling practices as well in the classroom. So what is it that's happening in Odisha that makes it such a shining example in the country?
Not just what is happening in Odisha. Yes, there are positive features. Now 19 of the tribal languages in Odisha are officially to be used for teaching at least some children in their mother tongues. But at the same time, the gap in multilingual education, since we are talking about the challenges and the benefits are many, but the challenges, the primary challenge is keeping all the languages at par. Unfortunately in India, because of the popular craze for English, regardless of the research evidences to the contrary, English has occupied a position where you cannot but take it to a different plane. Therefore, the main challenge to multilingual education is keeping the languages devoid or sort of isolated from the power hierarchy that is implicit in the way languages are perceived. No matter how much of mother tongue education you do, you always feel that if at all mother tongue education has some benefits, it's because it takes you to English little earlier perhaps. That kind of hierarchy is the major challenge in Indian situation, and the hierarchy is both political, social and otherwise. So that's the first challenge. And what is not happening is there is a wide gap in India, and that's what I'm sure Rukmini would definitely agree with me, between policy proclamations and actual implementation. Yes, Odisha has taken a lead in proclaiming a policy of mother tongue based education for tribal children, but the way the policy is implemented or has been implemented so far is horrible. Therefore, the unfortunate fallout of that is if you implement a good policy and implement it so poorly that the results are poor, then you are doing more disservice to a positive policy than you do otherwise. That's the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. I wondered if I could sort of bat back something of what Professor Mohanty said back to you, Dhir, about this disjunct between policy and implementation. You have been a policymaker and have also worked in implementation, so none better than you to comment on that.
So on MLE, we really do not have a national policy, and we've always made sort of half-hearted provisions in our. So whether it's the Constitution or the RT Act, we basically say, children should be taught in their mother tongue at the primary stage as far as practicable. So that's the stipulation. So the policy falls short of saying that children should be taught in their mother tongue. But as Professor Mohanty was saying, I mean, I come from a state. I've worked in a state where there are 10 mediums of instruction in Assam. And 6 other languages are taught as subjects, apart from Assamese and So, but there again, for these other languages, apart from the major languages like Assamese, Bodo, Bengali, at least these 3, a lot of the other languages, there is lip service in the sense that the books don't get revised in time. There are not enough teachers in those languages. There's not adequate training that happens in those languages. So I think it's important to recognize that we go with a good intention, and then when implementing it, it's far beyond the capacity of the institutions that we have. For example, SCRTs. So to bring out textbooks in 10 languages in all the subjects is something that they just cannot manage. So there is a huge issue. And then again, what happens is this, that when the package that goes to the field is just the materials, the textbooks reach, say, six months later, but there's been no training, no academic support, no monitoring, and then it starts to falter, then we start to say that probably that was not the right thing to do. And it's sort of, and it's very difficult to come back to that again. So that has been the experience in a lot of experiments.
Yes, please.
Sorry. I'd like to refer to Andhra Pradesh and the new state of Telangana. 5 languages in Andhra Pradesh form the core of the multilingual education project in Andhra Pradesh, and 3 tribal languages in the Telangana tribal education experiment. In the 2 states, we have 3 kinds of residential schools. One is simply called the Residential School Society schools. I simply call them the upper caste schools. The second one is a group of schools called the Social Welfare Residential Schools, or Residential School Society schools. And the third is the Tribal Welfare Residential School Society schools. Now, if you look at the Tribal Welfare Residential schools, education starts at class 5, actually in class 6, and they're all Telugu medium schools. Some English is taught later, and some Hindi is taught later, but there is no reference to the teaching of the languages to which these tribal children actually belong. So there is a problem even with the policy.
Yes, I was hoping to come to you, especially if you had to share something about the teacher's side of the story, because you may not be a linguist, you pretend not to be one.
But I have views on language. Yeah. Okay. No, I wanted to just follow through with what Paul was saying about ASER is done in rural areas every year, and we give the child the choice of the language, but usually the choice is the standard, the state language, and if it's a border district, then maybe the other state language. One year, 2006, we did an urban version of the ASER survey in 40 cities, which were, I think, million and more or 2 million and more, I've forgotten. And, there are common perceptions in India about where education levels are high and where they are low. And when we actually compiled the results, if you looked at just, very simple, very crude basic measures of ability to read simple text in a language of the child's choice, the lowest performing city was Bangalore. And that, of course, was a shock to many people who believe Bangalore is, you know, leading the country and not lagging behind. So when we looked at more closely at the Bangalore data, and I'm reminded of this from his comments about Hyderabad, that a very large percentage, and of course the sample was dominated by children from low-income families, went to private schools across most of these cities. But in Bangalore, there was two things. In Bangalore and Hyderabad, in that sense, shared the characteristics that children, very high proportion of children went to private schools. And these were private schools which are presumably low-cost private schools, where they chose to be tested in English because they went to English medium private schools. Whereas in other cities, whether it was in Gujarat or Maharashtra or Bengal or other places, the private school children actually went to their state language private schools. And what seemed to be happening in the examples that I'm giving are Bangalore and Hyderabad, is that they are neither gaining their state language, I'm not even talking about their home language, and nor are they gaining English. And by the time we did deeper work actually in Hyderabad, and we found that the private school performance was actually in some cases lower than the government school performance if the government school was at least in the state language. And transferring between these two schools then became very difficult. So after about 4th standard, when parents perhaps began to feel that the children had not gained as much as they had hoped by sending them to English schools, it was very difficult for these children to move back into the state language schools because the foundations were not there, there had been no exposure. And worse than that, I think, is the fact that everybody begins to feel the child is no good because he's been caught in the, you know. So, you know, in this whole English medium discussion, I think, you know, what kind of school it is and what is the, you know, the kind of underlying structure of what is going to happen and what kind of transition is going to be possible, I think also needs to be discussed. Because it is clear from the data that it is, these are not schools that are going to serve any kind of educational purpose, whether it is in whichever language. You know. Are there any questions?
Yeah, there's a question there in the middle. Come back to you, Ianthi, with one.
Good evening, everyone. I am Mrs. Rekha Balasubramaniam. I am a coordinator of a school. Now, all said and done, a multilingual approach or mother tongue approach, they are still beneficial to our learners. We will be able to do something with them. Whereas now the most feared problem now that is affecting the learners are, this is the influence of the digital language. In schools, when we start teaching this language from class, nursery, we are very scientific, teaching them English, phonetics and all that. Vowel sounds, diphthongs, everything we teach, and we try to teach them the right way of learning the sounds through which they construct the words. They are able to read, they are able to write, etc., etc. But when they reach the secondary and senior secondary level, of late, what is really affecting them, you must see their conversations, dialogues over the WhatsApp. They use this language sounds for Hindi conversation. All through they converse with each other only in Hindi. All the questions and answers are in Hindi, but the medium they use is English. That is the letters, the sounds, everything they use it. In such situation, how are we going to combat these problem and teach them the right and the wrong of the language in usage, both in oral as well as in written?
It's a very interesting question around impact of digital media on languages. Who would like to feel this? Yeah, I think audience, if you would like to also pitch in with opinion, please do. But Ianthi, if you had to go first.
Can you hear me? No? Yeah, so yeah, this is a question that is actually causing problems in a lot of countries, you know, because in many countries, children that use, you know, in cell phones and so on, all this texting, and they use the English alphabet, right, the English script, but actually the language has a different script, right? So the question is, how damaging is this? I think that there isn't much research yet that shows that it is indeed damaging. in my view, my prediction from what I know is that if these children actually are literate in Hindi or in any other language that we're talking about, they won't be really damaged. I mean, we are quite flexible cognitively to do this, and we do it, I mean, we do it on email messaging, and it doesn't really mean that something is lost from what we already know in terms of the script that we acquired. We have the flexibility of switching between two languages orally. I assume that many speakers of any Indian language can do code switching with English, right? Putting English words in it. And that's not really damaging for the knowledge you have of the language. I think the same applies to the script. So I don't think you need to worry too much about that.
Would just like to endorse what Ianthi said. I think we underestimate children when it comes to the use of language. I think children quickly learn that they can use a certain kind of language when they text, right? Or because of the influence of the digital media, a certain kind of language written in English script. But they also know what kind of English to use when they write a little composition for their teachers, right? I think this takes us back to the kind of language varieties that we all tend to use because of our multiple linguistic identities. So actually we shouldn't be too worried about this.
I'd like to take it a step further to say I think these kinds of new patterns of behavior that are showing up should be a source of research which shows us perhaps new ways in which to tackle the issue of language. I want to take the example of a research project we ran in very high illiteracy, very high adult illiteracy. Is that correct? I mean, women could not read or write, those kind of areas, in Bihar and in Rajasthan, two really backward blocks. And we were trying to see what can we do with the mothers of children who are in school between the ages of 4 and 8, whose mothers are actually illiterate. How can these mothers actually support the learning of children? And we tried a lot of methods, and clearly the cell phone was a factor in actually bridging this gap, because most of our literacy programs for adults are still operating on a traditional literacy. Now, the literacy methods have not changed very much, whereas people's use of letters and numbers have changed considerably. And we were able to actually, at that age, of course, the children are also learning, letters and numbers. We were able to do two things, I think. One is be able to see what mothers could do with cell phones and convince them that what you're doing in the cell phone, you can do actually with your kids as well. You don't only have to do it to your husband who's working in Delhi. Your child is in front of you, so you are actually numerate. You do recognize numbers. You are actually you're not literate in Hindi, but you're literate in the alphanumeric. And it did a huge amount for the confidence of people who thought of themselves as illiterate to say that actually I am not only literate, but I'm literate in like a foreign language. So I think that there are many things I think that can be done, which these new technologies are, and cell phone I think is one that is pervasive everywhere. I wonder if as a country we are doing enough to actually exploit some of these obvious patterns that are happening. One more question I had actually to researchers here as well as to you. We have two states in India which are English medium instruction in schools. One is Nagaland and one is Jammu and Kashmir. The home language or the regional language within the states, some have scripts which are in the English script, like in the Northeast, and some have scripts which are not. And I think that, looking at the research of what these children are gaining and in what pace between these two would be, I think, quite an interesting thing to do, because there are languages which have a script, there are languages which don't have a script, and then there are languages which have the script of the dominant language in a dominant language area. And I don't know what, universities or British Council or somebody should do to really spur language research of these kinds of very practical things on the ground, because we have a huge laboratory and there's lots of stuff going on, But we miss it in many ways because we can't connect it directly back to the, the classroom.
No. I have no understanding of it.
About this, yes, it would be great to do research on this, as long as we can match the children that we are comparing in terms of oral ability, oral skills in English. Because, that's the danger, because sometimes, the literacy part is a reflection of also what we know. So we really have to do that. I mean, it would be extremely interesting, but there must be some way in which we can see how good their oral English is and then look at the effect of the script.
Yes, please.
I'm just putting one information before you, that in 2010 we started People's Linguistic Survey of India, led by Ganeshnath Devi from Baroda, and about 860 languages have been documented by us during last 3 years. And on those volumes are now available in many states, and many states are coming up with all those languages. Now the question is that if the in 2001 census of India, there were only 192 or 1600. Total 152 languages were scheduled languages in the constitution. And now see, when the People's Linguistic Survey of India is conducted in almost all parts of the country, including the union territories, now you get about more than 860 living languages written and spoken by the people. The documents have been made by the speaking community themselves. I just imagine. This is one. And secondly, when in Article 350A of Indian Constitution has a mandate for mother tongue education, also the safeguard of linguistic minorities. In the whole Asia, there is no such provision in any constitution, but in India. And after 60 years now, we are talking about multilingual education in schools, and that is also in a very maladies situation. So just imagine that how we are not really addressing to the constitutional issues or the public issues. One example, that Santal community, those are distributed in 5 to 6 states, and they lost their identity in West Bengal, Orissa, Jharkhand, Bihar, and other. And now they say that, yeah, we want to learn English, but we want to be identified with our own language and script, and they got their language in 8th schedule. Many other languages also came in the 8 schedules. But if you ask Santali people that, how do you empower yourself? They will say that we empower ourselves with, one is our script and language, and then they call that our script and language has come in the internet. You just cannot stop it. That is the point they used to say. They use technology for that. And interestingly, in these 10 languages that the Odisha MLE program is taking up, Santali language is the script of the Santali language is called Olchiki. Olchiki. And that Olchiki script is used from class 1 to class 5 for language education. Language as a subject. They use Santali language and Olchiki script. So, in one hand, when they are interested to learn English and get empowerment, in one hand, on the other hand, they want to maintain their identity in a modern setting. So, it is the coexistence of both the local language and the global language that may help the future society to come up in the sense that we are not losing the local knowledge or local language or local ecology, but as well as we are contributing to contributing to the global knowledge through English language. Perhaps this is the solution that may take up this both the local and global together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dhir, you wanted to say something.
So one of the points regarding Santals in Assam that was coming up was in discussions, that can we use Santali as a medium and then move to English? Because this thing about the state language then our children will have to learn 3 languages. I mean, to be taught in school. They actually will learn Assamese anyway. But so can we have Santali and English? And that was a very tricky thing for the government to even think about. So in some tribal areas, there is this thing about why not use our language and then straight move to English.
Padmini, you have a question. I think that will be the last question we'll take, and then start concluding proceedings.
It's not a question, actually. It's just to continue with what Dhir was saying. There are problems in these tribal language decisions in MLE contexts about even which script to adopt. For example, the Boros in Assam are still divided over whether they should use the Roman script or the Devanagari script. And these issues are not just relating to the language, the common areas or something that facilitates their language. It's also political. So among the Santalis also, I mean, they would in Assam, I suppose they would agree that they prefer to call themselves Adivasiya, because there are several languages around Santali, etc., within the Adivasi group, and there is a lot of debate about which, among these, which should be adopted as a script. So it's not just that there's a problem, a hierarchy of languages, it's also within the tribal system. So all of these need to be addressed some way.
Thanks, Padmini, for that. I'd come back to the panel for your summary, but before that I wanted to put one final question to Ianthi, you, especially around this issue that cropped up a little bit in our discussions earlier today about is there any evidence around multiple languages or multiliteracy helping children with special needs or dyslexia? Would you like to comment on those areas?
Right, so that's a question that always comes up when we talk about, bilingualism or multilingualism. I can say a few things I know because I've done research on that with children with specific language impairment, that is children that have problems with developing, speaking and understanding the language, and that's, as we know, a genetic condition. There was a very large European network project, the COST Action, which was on bilingual children with specific language impairment. And we compared these children with monolingual children with specific language impairment. And what we found was actually that bilingualism does not disadvantage these children. Now, many of the children with specific language impairment will also show dyslexia. Okay, so because it's part of to the extent that developing reading and writing is associated with your phonological awareness, it is not surprising that many of these children actually have problems with developing reading skills. In any case, the results across the 33 countries have actually shown no evident disadvantage, okay, from bilingualism or multilingualism on issues of impairment, which is genetically imposed.
Thank you so much. Dhir, can I come back to you for final comments or summing up?
Yeah, I won't refer to what I said. Just want to caution, our government systems are, very often tend to roll out a prescription at a very large scale very quickly. And that happens in all cases and also for language. For example, right now in some states, what they're saying is they have assigned certain weights, and they say home language gets 35% weight in class 1, 20% class 2, etc. And how it's being implemented is they're creating textbooks with 35% of the lessons, the chapters, in the local language, and 65 in the other. That's the only, and then MLE is a tick mark there. It's done. So I think we've got to we have to understand that there is no package that can work in all the language situations that we have, even in a district, forget a state. So the answer is really to work on principles, to get teacher professional development into understanding how to work with multiple languages, how to ensure that children who are not familiar with the school language, what can be done with them, and what are the processes that can be followed, rather than form packages that will work in one or two situations but would be useless elsewhere. And that's a real risk that's currently there in several states.
Ianthi, we get your final comments.
Yes, I mean, the only thing I want to say is about, I mean, there has been a lot of discussion in education about methodology and how the teachers teach language or any subject, and sometimes how disappointing these methods are. I just want to finish on a sort of optimistic and positive note that whatever the teacher does, the learner is very creative. And so even if you bore them to death, they will still make something out of what they hear, especially at the implicit level, at the subconscious level. There is a lot of learning going on without the teacher aiming at it.
Thank you. Rukmini?
Yeah, I think 2 or 3 things that I've been thinking all day. One is that luckily there are no policies and regulations on parents. As a result, children all learn some language. Because as soon as you have schemes and programs and policies, it seems to stop, real development. So it's a good thing that at least the parents are in the non-government sphere and can do what they want at home. But on a more serious note, I think and I won't even limit it to say language instruction, but any good functioning school, I think, has some parent engagement. And if that parent engagement is built in some form or fashion into the functioning of the school, many of these things come closer, the school and the home come closer. And I would say that as one, I don't know, this can be done in different ways, in different places. I'd like to go back to something that Dhir said right in his opening comments, that this approach to language teaching really needs a big reform. I mean, we don't clearly teach reading in school. It's been a new thing to teach reading. We don't teach talking because we like children to be silent and listen to us. And we certainly don't teach writing because even if you look at what people in 10th standard are writing, we haven't taught them, anything. So what has been this language instruction for all these years, I often wonder. Because none of the key things of what you think about as language, talking, reading, or writing, is actually happening in the classroom. So if you had to begin again, I mean, I don't think anybody's beginning again, but if you had to begin again, perhaps this great importance to talk would have to be put in. And if you put an importance to talk, you will talk in the language that you know how to talk in. And in our experience, perhaps the best place to begin is in preschool, because you can't really discipline anybody there. If the child wants to talk, he's going to talk. And they're not as respectful of teachers and so on and so forth. So how do you increase, I mean, Indians talk a lot, as you can see, but we often don't talk enough in our institutional settings. Government meetings, only one fellow talks, usually the people who are, of these former ilk. So how do you increase talk among people within classrooms, I think, would really increase both language use, and how do you involve parents? I think these 2 things perhaps are not directly addressed in the traditional MLE, but I think these are the things that make it come alive.
Over to you, Paul. Famous last words.
I think as teachers, for instance, we need to analyze our own linguistic kind of identity. Because I think that translates itself into what we do in the classroom, very often what we don't do. I often ask myself, who am I really in terms of languages? I teach English. I've been teaching English for well over 40 years now. But I'm a Tamil speaker from Kannada-speaking Bangalore who moved to Telugu and Urdu-speaking Hyderabad 40 years ago. I'm married to a Hindi-speaking Punjabi from Himachal Pradesh. And because we don't share a common Indian language, we use English and a little bit of broken Hindi that I can muster. As a result, the first language of my 2 sons is English. I think all this has some kind of implication for what we become professionally in the classroom. And I think we need to take this a little seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'd like to just end with a couple of comments of my own. I came across this very interesting newspaper article day before yesterday coming back from Jaipur. Times of India reported on a very interesting study from mobile phone operators in India saying that 48% of Indian school students are now accessing the internet through mobile phones. So food for thought for everyone who are thinking about issues around digital literacy. The question of scriptural diversity, I think, is also something that needs to be thought about and looked into. It sometimes scares me that when I go to Chennai on work, I see all these advertisements in Tamil. I can't decipher it, but I can read them because it's written in the Roman script. Rukmini, you mentioned research into a couple of areas. Happy to say that we have instituted an English Language Teaching Research Partnership Awards. So the applications for this year have closed, but we are about to announce next year's awards. So anyone wishing to research in Nagaland and Kashmir, please visit our website and no, anywhere. Our research awards are open for everyone. So with those, may I now invite Chris for the next round of our events. Yeah.
Okay, it's my pleasure. I'm Chris Brandwood from British Council here. Just my pleasure to say thank you to our panelists. It's been, I think, a very really interesting and really nice conversation. I think one of my colleagues has some tokens of appreciation that we can hand to the panelists. Multilingual. Multilingual dictionaries would be appropriate, wouldn't they? Okay. Yeah. So thank you once again. Just yeah. Just a very final word, just on behalf of the British Council. You know, what we're about is bringing people together, and our aim in this is bringing experts and knowledge from, in this case, from India and the UK and Greece and many other places, to share research. And part of the initiative this week has been other meetings here to look at creating new research between our two countries. And it's quite plain in such a complex field that there's lots of scope for lots of research, and we've been particularly struck. And I've been quite taken actually from what Professor Mohanty has also been saying, the thing about the egalitarian approach to language and getting away from hierarchical approaches in schools. That a language, any language, should be a language of empowerment, whether it's the home language giving the cognitive benefits, which have already been demonstrated, and probably more research can show that even more, whether it's another language which, the digital language, I don't believe it, but whether it's English or Hindi, one of the power languages, which should be bringing opportunity to children in school and not excluding them, so that children, whether they come from a tribal background, from an urban background, a Hindi-speaking background, everybody gets an opportunity from each of their languages. And I think that should be the goal. There are 1.2 billion people in this country, isn't it? 30% of them, something like that, are under 15. And ultimately, the research, the activity, and the improvements in the implementation of these policies should be to their benefit. So let's think positively and hopefully with this research. Thank you to everybody here.